With the horrific events of Apollo 1 and the launch pad fire, the United States' hope was slowly fading away, but one mission changed it all. On July 20th, 1969, the US triumphantly landed 2 men on the moon, winning the space race against the Soviet Union. This victory for the United States proved to other countries that they could accomplish amazing space explorations, which led to the building of the International Space Station. Overall, Apollo 11 made many important scientific discoveries in space that led to many amazing space innovations.
The Cold War started in 1947 between the United States and the Soviet Union because of the economic and political philosophies. The US and the Soviet Union had very different points of view on both. The space race started 10 years later when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, an artificial satellite. The space race began with the Soviet Union, but a lot of the space race was in the United States. The Soviet Union was a communist country, and the US had been attentive of this for a while now. The United States had a different point of view about communism than the Soviets did. The article Cold War History clearly stated, after World War II drew close in the mid-20th century, a new conflict began. Known as the Cold War, this battle pitted the world's two great powers, the democratic capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union, against each other. Beginning in the late 1950s, space would become yet another dramatic arena for this competition, as each side sought to prove the superiority of its technology. World War II had just ended and the Cold War had just begun, so people were bitter and hoped that something good would happen. When Sputnik 1 was launched, the people of the US were shocked to see that the Soviet Union sent anything, much less a satellite, into space before them. The US and the Soviet Union had a rivalry between them before the space race, and when they launched Sputnik, things became even more intense. The US and the Soviet Union had very different opinions on just about everything. This caused a lot of conflicts between the two countries. The United States and the Soviet Union did fight together in World War II. This was only because Adolf Hitler, Germany's dictator at the time, betrayed Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union's leader. Though the Soviets and the US fought together, they did not by any means get along. Because of their different opinions and strategies on fighting the war, they did not always get the outcome they wanted. These disputes eventually led to the space race and the Cold War.
The space race started when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, an artificial satellite, into space. From the article Sputnik. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union initiated a space program named Sputnik, which made such historic achievements as putting the first satellite into orbit. It prepared the way for sending the first human aboard a spacecraft into orbit. After the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, their next goal was to launch a human into space. This was the overall goal for the US and the Soviet Union. Though the United States were achieving many things with their satellites, it seemed as if the Soviet Union was one step ahead of them. While the US were still working on their satellites, the Soviets started launching more animals into space. When the US created NASA, they started trying to launch people into space right away to catch up with the Soviets. This was a big mistake. The US's first mission started with Apollo 1. Soon after the Apollo program was started, the program came to a complete stop. Williams clearly states, the Apollo program was put on hold while an exhaustive investigation was made of the accident. It was concluded that most likely cause was a spark from a short circuit in a bundle of wires that ran to the left and just in front of Grisham's seat. A large amount of flammable material in the cabin and the oxygen environment allowed the fire to start and spread quickly. The US was devastated by what had happened and had to make sure it did not happen again.
In Cape Kennedy, July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 was launched into outer space. After the past attempts and fails of the United States, many people thought they would never get something or someone into space, much less land them on the moon. Apollo 1 was proven to be a fail when the astronauts traveling in it lost their lives in a launch pad fire. Nevertheless, Sarah Loft states, the primary objective of Apollo 11 was to complete a national goal set by President John F. Kennedy on May 25, 1961. Perform a crew lunar landing and return to Earth. Apollo 11 contained 3 people on the way to the moon. Neil Armstrong, the commander, Edwin Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, and lastly, Michael Collins, the command module pilot. Apollo 11 reached the moon on July 20, 1969. It was a nationwide goal for the United States to get someone on the moon, and almost everyone was watching the first steps. Even people from other countries were watching this great achievement. Sarah Loft also states an estimated 530 million people watched Armstrong's televised image and heard his voice describe the event as he took one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind on July 20th, 1969.
Small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
On July 24th, they headed back to Earth with their mission ending triumphantly.
There were many short-term impacts that affected everyone after Apollo 11, not just the United States and the Soviet Union. It affected the astronauts in a big way. As soon as the astronauts came off of the spacecraft, they were required to stay inside a facility in medical isolation for 3 weeks. They were put into quarantine to make sure that they were not affected by diseases or anything that could hurt anyone. But one of the biggest short-term impacts that happened right after was the Apollo 13. Apollo 13 was important because they were also trying to get to the moon, but there was an explosion in one of the oxygen tanks, so they had to turn around instead of landing on the moon and barely made it out alive. From the article called Apollo 13, electrical shorts in the fan circuit ignited the wire insulation, causing temperature and pressure to increase within cryogenic oxygen tank 2. When the pressure reached the cryogenic oxygen tank 2, relief valve full flow conditions of 1008 psi, the pressure began decreasing for about 9 seconds, at which time the relief valve probably receded, causing the pressure to rise again momentarily. About a quarter of a second later, a vibration disturbance was noted on the command module accelerometer. One of the main short-term impacts was the International Space Station that was put into space after the space race. The International Space Station is a large spacecraft that orbits around the Earth. It is a space environment research laboratory in which astronauts can conduct experiments in many fields of science. From the article, How Does the International Space Station Benefit Earth? Earth is monitored all day, every day from space as the space station passes over more than 90% of populated areas every 24 hours. There's a special imaging system on the station called the ISS Server, Environmental Research and Visualization System, which captures photographs of Earth from space for use in developing countries affected by natural disasters. This shows that the International Space Station has helped us in many ways, so that is why it was the most important short-term impact in space. All of these reasons clearly state that there were many important short-term impacts after Apollo 11 and the space race.
Several years later, Apollo 11 has impacted the world, from countries joining forces to rovers on Mars. Apollo 11 introduced what space is and what it can be. If not for Apollo 11, they would not have enough research and technology to get people and spacecrafts into outer space. Without Apollo 11, many spacecrafts and space explorations would not be possible. After Apollo 11, many other spacecrafts and rovers have gone into space. For example, 2 rovers were launched into space in 2003. This made way for one of the first Mars explorations. In accordance with Elizabeth Hallwell, Spirit is one of the 2 Mars rovers that NASA launched in 2003, is a part of an agency's $800 million Mars Exploration Rover mission. Spirit arrived at the Red Planet in January 2004, tasked with figuring out if life ever existed on Mars, learning about the Red Planet's current and past climate, and characterizing the Martian geology. Apollo 11 also encouraged more moon explorations. China sent a rover this year to explore the dark side of the moon. This exploration was influenced by Apollo 11 to explore and learn more about the moon. Overall, Apollo had drastic effects on space and the world. With the tragic outcome of Apollo 1, the United States was devastated. But one mission changed the course of history. It started with one satellite and had the outcome of a moon landing.
Apollo 11 introduced what space can be. With new technologies and future space missions, it proved to the world that anything was possible.